Kia ora koutou. We might get this second session for the morning underway. I'm Glenn Banks. I'm from Massey University. I know a few faces in the crowd, which is lovely to see. We've got 4 presentations this morning on a fairly diverse bunch of topics, so we're going to run the questions immediately after each of the presentations. I'll very briefly introduce each of the speakers come time for them to step up to the microphone. We're going to... Seva's told me he often runs over time, so I'm going to try and keep... He's going to be good today. He's going to be keep perfectly to time. Seva's on the teaching staff in Ethics and Governance in the School of Government, Development and International Affairs at USP. Come down for just for the week from Fiji. Great to see you here, and the microphone is yours. Thank you.
I'm controlling or you? Mbulunaka, everyone. I'm glad to be here and talk about something that I'm passionate about. Talking about land issues in Fiji. Right now we are in a very difficult environment when I talk about land. 91% of the land in Fiji is customarily owned. Although critical in development discourses, but this does not reflect on the livelihood, the well-being of the Itoke. So there's a dilemma there. The 2019-20 survey, household income expenditure survey report revealed that 36% of the Itoke live below the poverty line. And they constitute about 63% of the population. Yeah, so you own 91% of the land, and you are the poorest sector in your own land. So this recent demographic status trend is counterproductive to the government's rhetoric, we are leaving no one behind. The current government works, campaign, this is like the package, equality. But since 2006, the military takeover in Fiji, 27 decrees were passed amended concerning Itoke affairs on the pretext that they slow Itoke progress or source ethnic distrust. So this was a... What is the equal distribution policy? Basically, the name reflects that you share the least money equally to everyone from the old distribution policy, which benefits the chief more than the common people. Having said that, take into consideration that Fiji, like other Pacific Island society, we live communally. The tradition, rhetoric, paradigm is always there. This position reflects the government's, as I said already, mantra of common and equal citizenship, a common identity and a level playing field on which every citizen can excel. So now we are called Fijians. Itoke, sorry. Before Fijians for the native. And likewise, the policy also serves the Fiji national gender policy to promote gender equality, in all aspects of Fiji's development and to eradicate or modify institutional and social barriers to such equality. That's the study area. Nareo Village. If you've been to Fiji, Nareo Village is just located how do I? Okay, that's Nareo Village. And the other and the other tributary village is Nakavu, Yaquilau settlement, and Avatuleu. When I say they are not settlement, they are village. They are connected because of the traditional land. So it's population pressure, and so they moved to the Matangali land. It's located in the southwest region of Vitilevu. Has 4 tributary villages, as I mentioned, 755 members in 165 households. Living in the village, yeah? This is Nareo alone. The land tenure is ownership in common, meaning that everybody has access, equal right to the land that belong to the village. That's ownership in common. It's different from Matangali ownership, where only the Matangali owns the land. Only 3 villages in Fiji has this tenuership because of population pressure, and they're located close to urban areas. So that's the tribe, the 3 tribe that owns the Nareo Island. This is a picture from COVID-19, during COVID-19, help from Marriott Hotel, and the picture on your left, ILO representative visiting laid off workers, and discuss. If you also see the house, I would rank Nareo as the living standard is a decent one. And that house, the house project was initiated by the Tuinandi, the late Tuinandi, in 1960 to build 100 houses from the lease money. In one account, one of the respondents in Nareo was the paramount village, but is the poorest in terms of infrastructure, houses, and so forth, before tourism, before Nareo. That's Nareo Island, located in southwest Vitilevu. If you see the peninsula, and this is where 8 hotels are located: Marriott, Wyndham, Sheraton, Sofitel. All those land are native land. A land swap program started back in 1950. Land swap land project, meaning the developer will develop the land, and that's where the native land, where the hotels are located. The golf is crown land, and the residential areas, those are freehold. Total lease payment in 2017 is 1.2 million. Those are the land leases. Yeah? You see tourism constitute 1 million, and the rest is commercial, residential, and so forth. Comparison, the old and the new distribution. So if you check the one on my left, so the one on your right, yeah? The Turangani Vanua, 5%, that's the old distribution. We'll get 63,000, 10%, which is 120,000 for the tribe leader, tribal chief. The Turangani Matangali, 15%, which is 189,000. And the rest of the member will have 884,000 and 835. It seems big, yeah? But in reality, when you divide that land, that amount, it comes, don't disregard the one in the old distribution. There is another another figure for something else. But it gives you an idea of the old and the equal distribution. So in the new distribution, everybody will get $842. What is happening now? So that's the equal distribution policy. Some of the literature on the whole distribution. If you see that it blames the chiefs, it blames the colonial institution. In fact, that was the colonial construct. No, the indirect rule in Fiji. In order to get the chiefs' support, you give them a lot of share of the money from the land which is communally owned. That was 75 years in operation until 2015, when the new equal distribution policy was fully implemented. 75 years of inequality. Just in the new distribution, that's the minimum they get. It's supposed, in the interview, it's supposed everybody gets equal. So a lot of them say it's $20, but the lowest they get in 2019 was $30 in one payment per month. The highest they get is $600 in 1 year. So it fluctuates. Sometimes they get $60, sometimes they get $27. Response towards the equal distribution by gender, yes, people, women, they're like, yes, this is gender equality, right? A 36-year-old female explained, most people are happy as the ones, and they call it 1-1. Yeah? Gives us what we really deserve. Now it truly reflects the idea of ownership in common. Overcoming the Cinderella syndrome. The Cinderella syndrome is the fear of independence for women. This is the overwhelming theme that comes out from women. I'm independent. I don't have my husband now respect me. I'm an equal partner in household decision making. This is the story they're telling us. It makes the last one makes me a real and proud landowner. 25-year-old me. The ATM effect. Everybody has go to the ATM. In Fiji, remember, living in a village, you get an ATM card because of the equal distribution policy. You feel proud to go to the ATM, even if it's $30, $20. Okay, let me, does it contribute to the standard of living? Yes. Standard of living in Fiji is defined differently. Bill payments, subsistence, household furniture, this is improving their lifestyle. 24% say no because of traditional obligation, reciprocity, inconsistent value, and inheritance. They said, no, these things are inherited from before. The houses, we don't build this house. It's not about the equal distribution policy. It's about the old one. Respond to breakdown of it, okay, traditional norms. Just last one. 58% say equal distribution is detrimental to the culture of it, okay. The emotions comes with it. Attitude shift, drunkenness and rowdiness. Just one quote. 10% believe equal rights have been hijacked by some members to undermine custom. Quote in a key person interview. Young people seem to think that equal distribution give them the right to be equal with the older generation in the village. As a result, they become disrespectful even to their parents. You can't do anything because the government give least money as their share. And to take their shares can put parents into trouble because they are breaking the law. Chiefs and elders are demoted financially. Least money is part of our culture. This is one perspective. Least money is part of our culture. When you take it away, people do not know what to do, especially traditional leaders. Some can go crazy. All right, I'll stop there. The cognitive dissonance. In my interview, the rank they rank customary land as number one. When I ranked this number one, number two, identity value, spiritual, they said the commercial value is the last one. But in other questions, they show me their response what commercial values of land is the most important. Inconsistency in what you're saying and your belief, the cognitive dissonance that comes with. Thank you.
Don't go too far. There might be a question or two. Do we have any questions? We're having questions immediately after the presentations. Any questions on that from any of our knowledgeable Fijian audience out there?
Not knowledgeable on Fijian matters, sorry. But I just wondered whether there was, whether you had the gender breakdown for those that felt that this policy was detrimental to sort of cultural cohesiveness. Was there a gender breakdown of those?
Yeah. For women or for men, and both generally across the board, it was see the themes coming out for women, for women alone, as I said, it gives them that empowerment. For men, same thing, and some women who disagree with. I think the common theme that comes out is it's not right. You know, in a village, the man will always have their share. Some admit it. It makes women become so arrogant. I mean, that's for, and the age group for those who have this, the older one, not the middle age, not the young one.
Just a quick one. So for your presentation, one was talked about that. Quick question. Under ED, do the rent payments also go to registered members of the Matangali living outside the village?
Yes, it is.
So, and do you think that the increased payments going to, if you like, absentee members of the Matangali is contributing to a movement away from the village? In other words, if you get your income outside of the village, this is an old.
Good questions, because that will come from the, but good question. It is the bigger the number of members, the less the one they get, the less of the amount. Right? ATM, the ATM effect, people can access their money outside the village. Yeah? You can go to Suva. This is what happened to young people. During if they get 200, they collectively organize themselves, they travel to Suva. They drink, enjoy. When they have their own money, they come back to the village. And the parents say, hey, we contribute to the traditional obligations. There is no money. So one of the contributing factor about this, it destroys the very space of Itaukei identity. In the village, this is what is happening. Young people are not respecting their parents. Young people are not contributing to traditional. So what the older generation, they have to bear the burden of traditional obligation. It encourages people to be individualistic and family-oriented. Yeah.
Quick question, how many people did you survey? And also, did you ask people whether overall, considering financial benefits and the cultural costs, they thought the change was a good one?
Yeah, it's overall, the administered questionnaire was 55. Yeah.
Thought it was a good change?
Yeah, 55. 55 respondents. Overall, it was 86 key person interviews and formal talent. Yeah, and that was the theme that was coming out. And my PhD is on native land literacy and its impact on Itaukei welfare. 89% of the people can identify the land laws. 89 cannot understand, have any idea what is a customary land, my right, my lawful right as a customary landowner. 89%. And it's common. It's common. No, land literacy, that's why Fiji, that's why Fiji is in trouble. That's why we have coups. That's why people are easily manipulated to politicians and to everybody else. And a contributing factor to that, it is never included in our curriculum. Never.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you again, Seven. Right. Next up, we have myself and John Overton, and John's going to kick it off while I just go and get something from up there.
No mai, haere mai, ko John Overton and aho. You're going to wonder in this presentation why two old white men are talking about a book that was published 50 years ago, because that's what we're going to do. You'll probably still be wondering that at the end of the presentation. We're talking about a book that came out of the Australian National University, published in 1973, so it's not quite 50 years. And full disclosure, both Glenn and I spent time at the Department of Human Geography at ANU at different times. So we've had a connection with that department. The Australian National University was established, and the research schools at ANU were established to inform the Australian government about its policy. And the Research School of Pacific Studies, as it was then known, had an explicit role to inform the Australian government about its colonial policy in Papua New Guinea and also its policies with regard to the rest of the Pacific. The Department of Human Geography, the two big figures at in that department were Harold Brookfield. Harold Brookfield, you can see in that photo there with his wife Muriel, just after they got a job in South Africa in 1948. It's a scurrilous photo, but I can't help but show it with Harold in his safari outfit and off to the colonies to, start his academic career. The second person was the famous Oscar Spate, who Seven I mentioned in terms of the Spate report and his work in Fiji and Papua New Guinea. And these were literally the founding fathers of the Human Geography Department. Oscar Spate did his studies at Cambridge. He was a member of the Communist Party in Cambridge in the 1930s, but got thrown out, he said, because he had a sense of humour. He told jokes and the Communist Party didn't like that. But we're talking in particular about a book that was published, The Pacific in Transition. All of the authors came through ANU, and the book embodied a certain type of geography based on intensive field work in the Pacific region. It was not the new geography, the quantitative stuff. It predated radical geography, dependency theory, and so on. Old style, dirty boots, get in the field, descriptive and analytical work. And why we're interested, it occurred at a particular moment historically. The book was published between Fiji's independence in 1970 and PNG's independence in 1975. So it was on that cusp of decolonisation. And we would say it marked a record of the sort of colonial gaze on the Pacific at the time. That's a picture of the department at the time. I love these old black and white photographs. Brookfield and Spate, the two central figures there, a couple of others that we might mention. There were 12 chapters in the book, and we could talk about most of them, but we're only going to focus on three, the last three chapters of the authors for reasons that we'll mention. Glenn.
Great. Thank you, John. If we just go back one of the things about the table of contents is there's one woman amongst the authors and there's one Pacific Islander amongst the authors. So we'll come back to that as a point of difference. But the one woman, Diana Howlett, Professor of Geography at ANU, she was the second woman, I think, to get a geography PhD in Australia, I think, in 1962, appointed as full professor in 1982, and focused, where's Hannah? She focused her work on Goroka in the highlands of Papua New Guinea from the 1950s. And I first encountered this chapter when I was an undergraduate, and it struck me at the time that this was a fairly telling piece of work, because this was a period in which modernisation theory, this idea that development was something that could be rolled out and it would roll through societies, and they would move from tribal societies to peasantry and into industrialisation and modern societies and everything. And Diana held it up there in the 1960s, came to the conclusion that there was something going on here. And she argued that instead of this transition from a tribal society to peasantry and then onwards in the development ladder of modernisation, Gorokan society was well on the way to being stuck as in that peasantry phase. So she talks about this notion of terminal development, chapters entitled Terminal Development, and saying that there's no indication that they're going to move as the theory, as development policy and everything said they should be moving, that they were going to move on. And this was one of the first, you got a sense of a real unsettledness of thinking amongst academics in Australia that, hey, this development stuff, it might be more complicated than what the economists have mapped out. And she used a lovely telling phrase of the infinite pause. She talks about the infinite pause that might settle over the Gorokan Valley as a result of where they've got to. So that's one of the chapters. Then equally kind of disconcerting in terms of development theory was a chapter by William Clark, again with a Papua New Guinea focus. He did his PhD, in fact he was a product very much of University of California, Berkeley, and did his fieldwork, his PhD fieldwork amongst recently contacted people in the Bismarck Range and the northern range of Papua New Guinea. And he was very much coming out of a human ecology background, so he was interested in human-environment relationships. And he had picked up through, I think, his education in California, a concern with what he called imminent earthly calamities. This is 50 years ago. He was concerned about the fact that there were some ecological truths getting in the way of the development paradigm of the time. So he has beautiful sections where he sort of starts to really question this idea that permanent growth is actually possible. So he says, no, permanent growth is impossible. We can't go on doing this. And he talks about the advantages of diversity, again, in contrast to this idea that a much more homogenous society, homogenous forms of agriculture are going to flow. And he talked about the way in which economic development needs to be framed by this alternative kind of paradigm. And he ends up with some visions for alternative forms of development. And so he actually talks about alternative development 50 years ago. So some of these, we could be two old white men standing up here saying, we all talked about all these things, well, somebody, not us, but other people were talking about all these things 50 years ago, alternatives to development and so on. And he had a lovely phrase, his lovely phrase that I use is, he's looking for alternatives where development that is not morbid growth, but another sort of expansion in ways of living. So you can think of that kind of language in terms of well-being, the sorts of discourse that we are engaged in today in terms of alternative forms of development thinking. John is now going to take over the last...
Our third and final chapter that we looked at is an interesting one. This was Israeli Lasanga from Fiji, the only Pacific Island author in that collection, the only Pacific voice in the book. Israeli Lasanga is a very interesting character. I wish I knew more about Israeli. He's got his PhD from ANU in 1968. Just before that, he wrote a book on the Fijian people. He had been groomed, I think, by Ratu Mara and others to take on a leadership role in the newly independent Fiji, and he rose to become secretary to cabinet, a very senior civil servant. But in this book, Brockfield, who was the editor of the book, I think quite well at the time, said to Essarelli, okay, you've got the last word. We've done this collection of our studies. What do you make of them? And I read this chapter and I've reread it and read it again, and Essarelli Lasanga's style is quite reserved. I won't say deferential, but he was polite in what he said, but what he really said, I think, were telling critiques of the book and of that body of work. He, again, couched in fairly mild terms, but he said, you don't really get it, do you? And you don't really get the connection that Pacific people have with the land, a deep spiritual connection that we have. So you're talking about things, and I don't think he was necessarily talking about the authors in the book, but the wider body of Palangi research at the time about transitions and urbanisation and moving from the village land to the city. And so, you don't get it. There's that deep connection with the land. And you don't get it in terms of why we would change. You know, that's a simply materialist view of development. It's not really what we're about. There's a whole lot of other considerations for Pacifica in terms of what we see as a good life. And tellingly, he also said, how about in future more research is done by Pacific scholars, right? So this is, I suppose, the early voice about decolonising research. And his telling phrase was a deep analysis of the viewpoint of the local people should be developed in future. How about asking people what they think, what they want, and so on? Okay, so there's our 3 chapters. We'll just quickly, I don't know how much time we've got, just perhaps the two of us will tweedledum, tweedledee this for a while. As Glenn said, what we don't want to do is present this as a celebration and say, oh, these people 50 years ago, they had it all right. But what I think we can say is that this work that's based on intensive field research, deep immersion in many cases, captured a particular moment in time. And I think it does, for us, say some really interesting things about change. And I've just seen the red sign
right,
there.
Right. You've all got eyes, you can read. I think when we came back to this book, and it just happened to be when I was shifting offices, I came across this and thought, hey, that's kind of what our Marsden project that John and I are currently engaged in. Is it really an update of this? And it's not, but it was interesting to look at that in the context of our Marsden project we've got, which is about understanding, going down and asking people about notions of adaptation and resilience across the Pacific. So it really questioned some of these dominant theories of change and development. And Harold Brookfield was a cranky old bugger. I knew him when I first started at ANU. And he had no time for postmodernism or any of that, you know, that furry, fluffy stuff. This kind of fieldwork was what he believed in. But he actually says in the introduction that, hey, this is actually, as an editor, a really uncomfortable collection of essays because it started to really question some of the dominant paradigms about development. And I could almost see almost the postmodern Harold Brookfield coming through in here, which he would be rolling in his grave if he heard me saying that. So it's been a really interesting exercise to go back to this. And in terms of our project, there's some threads in there that we are picking up and running with, focusing on different and dominant narratives and theories of change, questioning interpretation of change from a local perspective, and really emphasising the critical importance of local narratives of change and ownership of these knowledges. So we'll leave it there, and happy to take some questions, 1, 2 questions at most. Thank you. I was going to say it would be good if there were no questions, but 2 minutes.
Oh, just quickly, and this is a comment, I couldn't resist the most recent ANU press book on Papua New Guinea has 8 Australian authors, 1 New Zealand co-author, 6 co-authors from Papua New Guinea, and 5 co-authors from the Indian subcontinent who live in Port Moresby.
Yeah, so a much more diverse group.
Maybe
yeah.
that's
Yeah.
Why do you think Lasanga was invited to contribute to the book in the first place?
Yeah, it was. He had been a PhD student at ANU, pulled in largely, I think, because of Oscar Spate's involvement in Fiji and his connections. I think they genuinely wanted some feedback, and I think Israeli had, no doubt, prior to this book, made a few quiet comments that I think Brookfield did want to put in the book. Interestingly, reading the book in the foreword was written by Oscar Spate, who none too subtly slapped Israeli down in print, sort of saying, oh, well, that's all very well, but why don't you examine your own preconceptions and so on? And it was a pretty nasty put down by Spate. But I think Brookfield and the others did see some value in getting that feedback into print at the time.
You mentioned that some of the things Lasanga was saying were quite diplomatic. Do you think that there was a degree of editing there?
I don't know. Being Brookfield, yes, there would have been editing, but I'm not sure it necessarily would have been a silencing. I think that, and reading other things that Israeli Lasanga wrote, that was reasonably consistent with his style of writing. Pretty reserved, but the message was there.
Yeah, and I think too the fact that Brookfield was starting to feel uncomfortable about some of the stuff that was being generated kind of opened space for a mild form of critique at least. Yeah.
What were American researchers saying about the subject at the same time, on the other side of the Pacific?
Well, I don't know if Bill Adams would be an exemplar of that sort of thing, but certainly the strong environmental consciousness that he brought to his work and the focus on the human ecological side is one thing. American geographers working in PNG, I know there were a lot of American anthropologists in PNG, probably more than geographers. So they were bringing very different traditions and so on. But short answer is, I don't know.
Yeah, and I'm not sure. I would suspect at the time, fairly strongly modernisation theory informed view of change. This idea of transition and they're going to become modern and et cetera, et cetera. I would suspect. I don't really know.
Right. Oh, one.
Yeah, just in line with this question, I was wanting to ask because from memory, when in 1968, the limiting growth book came out after that meeting, and they were supposed to have invited scientists from around the world, and I was going to ask if they did, if those people were connected up to that, because the ideas very kind of feed into this meeting.
Certainly Bill Adams cites Club of Rome and so on in terms of his critique of development as he was seeing it not unfold on the ground.
Excuse me. Would you have access to a list or a very good list of development studies books, at Massey University? Or
Absolutely, the library. Yep.
We can have a look at.
Yep. For sure, can do that. Okay, we might exit stage left. And Okumini is I want to say you're a PhD student, Massey, is that correct? Master's student. I had this sudden moment where I thought, PhD quality master's student. Talking about the RSE scheme and you can see there. So the stage is yours.
Thank you. Moi te whātalo whātu le pa ia man malu wā whia, talofa lava. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I am Oiko Mene Mawale Vau, as you can see there, Chantung, a master's student from Massey University. I do apologize if I confuse people. I'm very nervous, and English is my second language, so please bear with me. This presentation, which you've seen the topic before in the last slide, looks at the contribution of the RSE scheme to the Government of New Zealand to identify some of the direct revenues to the New Zealand government, compare to the cost of running this labour mobility program. We will also look to do a comparison to direct revenues and costs to Samoa government as a participating Pacific government in the RSE scheme. We will then explain how this is viewed from the Fa'afalitui framework. But before I present the findings, I want to briefly touch on the literature that currently exists on the RSE scheme and what benefits have been identified. I'm supposed to fly up, but it's all right. The RSE scheme has been described by the World Bank as one of the most effective development interventions for which rigorous evaluation are available. The second objective also of the RSE scheme is to encourage economic development in labour-sending countries. The current literature of RSE refers to the RSE scheme as a triple win. This refers to the benefit to RSE employers, Pacific RSE workers, the benefits at the bottom down, Pacific governments. But what the current literature did not expand on or highlight is the benefits or contribution of the RSE scheme to the government of Aotearoa, New Zealand, which is the findings that this research will be presenting today. Let us look, Let us look at the contribution of the RSE scheme to Aotearoa, New Zealand's government by revenue sources from the fiscal year 2015-16 to 2020-2021. We identify these revenues as PAYE, fees paid to Immigration New Zealand, and taxes paid by RSE employers who use mainly RSE workers and also employers who employ RSE workers in a part of the operations. RSE workers for tax purposes use the tax code NSW, non-resident seasonal worker. This code has a flat rate of 10.5% PAYE and a 1.46% earnest levy. The NSW tax code was first introduced in 2009 for non-resident seasonal workers, which include RSE workers and foreign fisheries workers, at a flat rate of 15%. In 2010, the Pacific States officials involved in the RSE scheme discussed with the Department of Labour, now MBIE, the possibility of reducing tax rates for RSE given the reduction of the personal tax rate in New Zealand. Consultations were done and supported the reduction of the tax rate for the NSW tax code from 15% to 10.5% as it is now. Here is how much PAYE is paid by RSE workers to New Zealand government. This information was released under an OIA request to the Inland Revenue Department of employees taxed on the NSW code where there is an indicator of RSE. According to Immigration New Zealand's website, in order for an employer to bring workers under the RSE scheme, the employer needs to submit an application to obtain an RSE status. Following this process, the employer will then need to apply for an ATR or agreement to recruit to enable them to enter the country. As an RSE worker, on the other hand, they also need a visa to enter the country. Let us look at the revenues collected by Immigration New Zealand from 15-16 to 2020-21 on related visa applications. This is a total of the visa fees. Visa fees for RSE workers are single entry, or visas for RSE workers are single entry. And every year they will need to reapply to return to New Zealand for work. ATR approvals or agreement to recruit also expire after every recruitment, and the employer can submit multiple applications with a charge for every single one of them. RSE status or licenses is valid for 2 years for newcomers and 3 years validity for those who are second-time applicants. If we total all the visas and other fees charged, this is what we will have. Also note that there is a drop in revenue in the year 2020-2021 due to border restrictions and Immigration New Zealand having to extend visas without charges due to COVID. The RSE scheme's main objective was to assist employers with their demand of labor. This demand has been met by the labor supplied by Pacific countries. As such, the industries involved in the scheme are thriving and are growing remarkably. At the same time, the Government of New Zealand also receives a share of this growth via the taxes that corporate RSEs and small to medium RSE employers pay. Here we look at two listed companies, namely Scales, Mr. Apple's parent company, and Sika, a fruit company whose operations are in New Zealand and Australia. Information was extracted from these two companies' financial reports that were publicly available. Here is an estimated portion of taxes paid for a segment that rely on RSE workers. Over 6 years, from 2016 to 2021, an estimated total of cost of company taxes paid by these two companies summed up to $53,973,000. In addition, we also requested information from two RSE employers that wish to remain anonymous. We acknowledge that not all companies are the same in size and profitability, but from analyzing the two unlisted companies that pay a combined tax amount of $571,788,000 to the New Zealand government in one financial year, imagine how much approximately 150 RSE employers can contribute as company taxes to the development of New Zealand. Direct cost of the scheme to the New Zealand government. The New Zealand government's operational arm for the RSE scheme sits under the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. This includes Immigration New Zealand and Labour Inspector. In addition, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade also assist in funding some parts of the operational arm of the scheme. This is the budget for running the scheme. This information was released under OIA to MBIE. However, part of the request to access budget allocation for other units under MBIE, such as immigration compliance and the RSE unit processing team, which plays very active roles in running the day-to-day operations of the schemes, was not made available under the OIA response. This is due to these budgets being apportioned to the office rather than an individual product, meaning if there is no RSE scheme, the processing units and compliance team will still operate as they also deal with other types of visas. Vakamesina is an MFET-funded program specifically tailored for RSE workers. This program focuses on English language literacy, numeracy, financial digital literacy, and life skills. The budget allocated for this training program is $5 million for 5 years. Would it be fair to say that if we ignore costs recovered from visa processing, such as visa fees, etc., we can see that the operational cost of managing the RSE scheme by the New Zealand government can be self-sufficient if we look at the PAYE of these RSE workers as shown here. The contribution of these RSE workers by way of PAYE taxes are never highlighted. The addition of company taxes from unlisted companies, as also highlighted before, further solidifies that this scheme is truly beneficial to the development of New Zealand. It is worth noting that as RSE workers are migrants, they are not entitled to any welfare or unemployment benefits if they stay off work for an extended period due to unforeseen circumstances. Any medical costs are borne by the respective insurance companies, if eligible, which the RSE workers also pay for as a requirement for their visa applications. Let us look at the cost and benefits to Samoa government as an example of a participating Pacific sending government. The RSE scheme is managed by the Ministry of Commerce, Industry and Labour in Samoa. We can see that in the past 6 years, Samoa has allocated a budget of 2.9 million Samoan tala to run the operations in the country, equivalent to 1.7 million New Zealand dollars at an exchange rate of 1.72. This budget funds all labour mobility schemes that are under MSIL. It includes funding officials to support RSE employers with recruitment in Samoa, and also a liaison officer based in New Zealand in Hawke's Bay to support the RSE workers and employers, as well as providing advice to New Zealand governments onshore. Recently, Samoa government approved a second liaison officer to be based in New Zealand for the South Island. As you can see, apart from the cash grants from Australia government, Samoa government is having to tap into non-RSE taxpayers' money to invest in the RSE scheme. Not until recently, which is reflected in their 22-23 budget, that Samoa received other in-kind from DFAT Australia and cash grants from ILO for their budget support. Here is a summary of the stats I just talked about. Does Samoa government benefit in the same areas as the New Zealand governments? Workers don't pay PAYE to Samoa government. According to an MSIL representative, the Samoa government does not charge any fees to the workers or the RSE employers for recruitment purposes. Apart from the medical and police reports that workers pay to other ministries like the health and police as part of the New Zealand visa application requirements, costs to the government are not recovered. They do not receive any other source of income apart from foreign cash grants and in-kind donations from the Australian government and ILO. It can be argued that governments such as Samoa earn GST from any purchase being used with the RSE remittances, but it is the same case as the labor receiving country such as New Zealand, and it is disproportionate given the level of RSE worker spending in New Zealand, including consumptions, deductions of accommodation, medical insurance, and transportation. It is also fair to note that rules around GST differs in New Zealand and Samoa. This research acknowledges that people will buy goods and services with the money that they remit. However, the day-to-day spending of the family on other services such as public transport, buses and taxis, including inter-island ferries, are zero-rated in Samoa, meaning they are not subject to GST and will not provide any revenue to their government. Moreover, the provision of everyday water and electricity is also zero-rated. Due to the scope of the research, we are not able to look into GST in more detail. You may ask as well, that PAYE in New Zealand, you may ask that, well, PAYE in New Zealand is a contribution of the RSE workers to the services and infrastructure. That they access while here. Mind you, in New Zealand, RSE workers pay for accommodation, weekly transport, airfares, medical insurances, and again, they are not eligible for public funded services. With the findings of this research, we are able to contribute to the existing literature to fill the gap regarding the contribution of the RSE scheme to the New Zealand government. However, what we have come to identify is that while Samoan workers, RSE employers, and New Zealand government are all benefiting from the RSE scheme, the Samoa government is having to pay or invest in order for their workers to participate in this bilateral agreement. Would it be fair to say that the costs to Samoa government are much more than the benefits? The literature on the RSE scheme constantly promotes that New Zealand is developing participating countries like Samoa through RSE. There is no denying that the scheme has helped thousands of families in the Pacific to build houses, buy cars, create small businesses, put children through education. The RSE workers are able to develop their families because of the hard-earned money they get paid in New Zealand from working outside in very cold winters, and in hot summers. They sign contracts with RSE employers so they can work. You and I do precisely the same thing, but do we call what we do our arrangement with our employer a development program? Shall we say it is purely a business arrangement? With the New Zealand government's benefits being identified, one could argue that this partnership between these two governments is unequal. This brings us to the Fa'afalitui framework. Fa'afalitui is inspired by the work of my dear friend, Dr. Honiara Salanua, a lecturer at the National University of Samoa. Whawhaletui is described as a superior body of people coming together with a common purpose for greater benefits. Whawhaletui is translated as wha'a, tu, wha'ale, meaning sharing and exchanging of ideas, and tui as paramount chiefs like Tuitonga and Tuimanua. This picture here shows the seating during an important meeting of whono. The paramount chiefs are seated at the tala of the whale, which are the side posts, while the other chiefs are seated at the pepe of the whale, moving in. And the taupo are also in the picture preparing the awa ceremony. The awa ceremony represents how important the meeting is. In applying this framework to this research, we consider the two governments to be paramount chiefs in an equal relationship. They negotiate the best terms and conditions that will benefit their people or their villages. However, what we have come to identify is that there is inequality in the benefits that each paramount chief is receiving in this partnership. We have recognized that paramount chiefs from Samoa government is investing more financially for its village to participate, while the paramount chief New Zealand government's limited investment in extensive benefits are not openly reported. What is more interesting, the literature on the scheme perpetuates that New Zealand paramount chiefs is bringing development to the Samoa paramount chiefs village. From a Pacific lens, this relational inequity does not represent a relationship as depicted by Whawhaletui, but merely a business arrangement that seeks profits rather than a partnership for development. We see the Pacific countries are having to compete against each other to attract RSE employers to recruit from their countries. This is because the country of recruitment is decided by the employer, which means that the RSE scheme has placed Pacific countries against each other in competition, which runs against relational principles in partnership for development. It also goes against Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade's Honourable Mananaia Mahuta's statement in remembering that we share whakapapa. And the relationship across Te Moana Nui Akiwa, Pacific Ocean, is fundamental for development. This relational equity should then be at the center and foundational to schemes such as the RSE. One can argue that Whawhaletui is happening at the moment, and discussions between the two governments already and have been held. However, inequality exists between this relationship as the benefits to the paramount chiefs are currently unknown and probably not realized by the paramount chiefs themselves. To conclude, shall we say, the Pacific is developing New Zealand through the RSE scheme. Whawhatailao.
We've probably got time for a quick question. I mean, to me, that raises so many questions, and it's a form of analysis I haven't seen before of the RSE, so fantastic work. We've got two quick questions.
Thank you very much for that. That's enlightening for us. And just want to ask this question. Somebody asked me to translate the contract for him when he got to Australia, just so he understood what all the amounts that were taken off. And it got to the stage where when there are the deductions from their pay, and one of the very last deduction was about the super aspect of it. And I saw that then the contract talked about doing the super, and then he will be given that when he gets home. But this is Tonga. But a good percentage of that, a big percentage, was going to go to the government of Tonga. This has to be checked because I was just translating. I just wondered if you found something, obviously not, but an aspect that we need to care for.
Thank you for the question. I think the scope of the research doesn't really tap into that, and that's Australia. I think my focus is on the RSE scheme at this stage.
One last question.
So, it's very
was very blessed to be able to write an article along with Athena and Gina on RSE schemes. And what you see now, as you probably noticed, is that it's not only low-skilled workers, but also teachers and mechanics and people now in New Zealand, and they're quite happy to give up their jobs to come and do horticulture, agriculture jobs here in New Zealand. So I guess for me, what is your take on balancing the inequity in terms of the financial benefits for each government? How could they improve the financial benefits for the workers so that they don't leave Pacific, or how could the New Zealand government make it happen?
Well,
It's a big question.
yeah, thank you. Well, who wouldn't? Who wouldn't want to earn more than what you get back in the islands? But I guess that's something that the government of Samoa will need to do. It's also beyond the scope of the research. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you so much. And the last presentation is from a colleague of mine at Massey, Associate Professor Tracy Mafaleo, who is associate, amongst other roles, taken on this year the Associate Dean Pacifica for the College of Health. Tracy, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. I think it's still morning. Malolele and tēnā koutou katoa. We all have stories. Ko hoku hingawa, ko Tracy Mafileo. I am the daughter of Mohetao Mafileo and Margaret Nee Smith. Settler ancestors sweeping into Aotearoa and other centuries on my maternal side. Roots in Moana Nui a Kiwa, the Sea of Islands on my father's side. From the village of Te Ikiu, Tongatapu, he took mobility into his own hands, stowing away on a ship from Tonga to Fiji, and then from Fiji to Tonga in the to New Zealand in the 1960s. In previous generations, my great-great, or perhaps my great-great-grandfather from Nukulailai Tuvalu, the story goes, was lost at sea and ended up in Tonga. The peoples of Nanumea Island, Tuvalu, where my husband was born, celebrate Te Pō Te Wholaha every January. It's a celebration of the Nanumeans conquering a Tongan giant who attempted to invade their island. As Pacific peoples, we have stories, including family stories, which connect us to each other and to larger socio-political, cultural, environmental events. Stories which have meaning for our past, our present, and our future. Storying and lived experience of climate mobilities also provide policy-relevant knowledge. In this presentation, I'm going to be discussing planning for a multi-generational family story study to investigate resilience and well-being in the context of climate mobilities for families of 6 Pacific countries: Kiribati, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Tokelau, Tonga, and Tuvalu. Oops. Am I pressing the wrong button? Oh, this one, okay. Okay, as both these Pacific thought leaders state, the essence of our belonging as Pacific peoples is collective and connected, and family, land, sea, the spiritual realm, cosmos. Mobility, navigation, and enlarging our world is part of our stories. In the context of climate change, our family or kin group mobility stories are a rich source of knowledge to inform policy. So a little bit of the background. Mana Pacific Consultants was contracted by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. In fact, thank you very much. And I think there might be Sarah here. Sarah, thank you, Sarah McKenna. Also acknowledge Pedro van der Ent, who is here, along with 2 other suppliers, University of Auckland and University of Waikato, to undertake phase 1, a planning phase of a research program. And the overall research program responds to this cabinet paper, and then the tasking of officials to commission robust research that would achieve outcomes such as factors influencing mobilities mapped, Pacific resilience and decision-making related to climate mobility explored and examined, past, current and future climate mobility patterns identified, Pacific experiences explored, including social, cultural, economic impacts of past and current mobilities, social, cultural and economic impacts of future mobilities identified, and a cohort of Pacific researchers able to lead climate mobility research developed. So our Mana Pacific study seeks to understand, through a family lens, experiences of resilience and well-being in the context of climate change mobility. The research findings will support New Zealand and Pacific Island countries to develop evidence-based migration climate change policies based partly on these stories. So this is our team. All researchers are of Pacific ethnicities. There is a call for Pacific-led research using Pacific methodologies. Most of our team currently live in Pacific Island nations who are undertaking our study, and I do want to acknowledge my colleague, Dr. Hannah Stephen, who is here in this very room, who is our PNG researcher for the study. Some of our team are based in New Zealand or Australia, and will travel back to their Pacific Island homeland where they've lived. Just acknowledge the team who's come together to help us do this. So all of the three research suppliers undertook a gap analysis, a little bit of a literature scan, and for us we focused on literature and studies related to our particular approach that we proposed to take. And some of the needs include a need to have more stories of people who are living in communities, more local knowledge from the ground up to inform climate change policy as well as climate mobility policy. It needs to be a holistic approach, not just looking at the scientific part, but also the non-economic losses and considering health and well-being, and needs to take into consideration the connection between people, families and kinship groups to land, to understand resilience and adapting in place, re-emplacement. There's sometimes the flows actually go against what is expected, and people consciously make the decision to re-emplace for cultural significance and the meaning that brings. For Pacific Voices ownership and agency, and for Pacific Indigenous research methodologies to be used too. So our focus is on particular research areas. So some of the questions will include: what are the cultural dimensions of resilience? How do Pacific families story their ancestors' resilience, and what does this mean for how they understand climate mobility or their choices to stay in place as well? What does that look like for families who choose to stay? What role does Pacific land tenure systems have on Pacific families' climate change mobility resilience? Also around well-being, how is that understood? What are the impacts of climate mobility on families' well-being and human security? And what are the differential impacts? And then what international donor, government, NGO, church or diaspora support has been meaningful to Pacific families experiencing climate mobility, and why? What do they think is needed? How can human dignity and collective Indigenous rights be promoted? So the approach we have proposed to take is really a stories approach, a multi-generational family stories approach. Stories is something that is a part of Pacific cultures as well, and there's a Tongan proverb here: roll out the mat so the family can dialogue. Story has also been written about as an approach to decolonise teaching, and importantly research as well. To balance out some of the numbers, bring some of the stories in. So we want to engage probably around 10 families across these six countries, between 1 to 3 in each country. And we want to see at least 2 different generations. So we have the wisdom bearers of our elders as well as our younger voices in these dalanoa or talk story. And we also expect that family or kin group members will be across different locations. So they could be in Port Moresby, or they could be up in Bena district, or they could be in New Zealand or Australia. So just capturing that family lens across time and space. So the research methods that we are adopting here are dalanoa and talk story. I really appreciate this more recent work on dalanoa, describing it as relationally mindful, critical oratory. And there's so much involved in that. But I think dalanoa is able to kind of capture that richness that happens in the relational space. It's relationally mindful, but it's also critical oratory. So I think that's where we get some, we can get some innovation, some change, and some ideas from there. Talk story as well, and we have a participatory arts-based approach as well. So we want to invite the families who are willing to be perhaps videoed or have some photos taken, and then we want to use found poetry to co-produce with the representative from the family or kin group a digital format of that story as part of the research. This is just a really quick overview of some of the areas that we're looking at having our families involved from, and also some of the themes and focus areas. Just in terms of analysis, the plan there is recognising that the participatory arts-based co-production embeds collaborative and creative analysis in the process. There'll also be thematic analysis with the dalanoa and talk story. And just recently I've appreciated in some work how for dalanoa methodology for data collection, I think also requires a dalanoa process as part of the analysis, that it just can't all happen with one person on a computer, that we have to provide those spaces for the dalanoa to reflect on, the data. So hopefully we can have some money to help us get together to do that. Okay. So we want to do some analysis in terms of that family stories level, but then to work with the other research supplies and other literature looking at that within a country context, and then what that looks like across the region, but very much grounded in that family context. So the next steps are on Monday, the 3 research supplies will be submitting our final research plan. We'll be doing ethics, and we hope to start work in the first quarter of 2023. And I will stop. Time's up. The sign says.
Thank you very much, Tracy. Fascinating study, and we need to talk more. Questions?
Just a comment. Congratulations on winning this contract.
Yeah, a little small fish.
Your team look like the best people to be doing it. So well done.
And probably a thank you to MFAT too for funding it.
Oh yes, that was on my notes. Yes, acknowledging.
I think it's great that MFAT are involved in the funding of this kind of project too. It's great.
Okay.
Hang on, no, don't go anywhere.
Just a question, and I'm sure there's much more to it than that. Just the premise of climate mobility, and suggests that yes, there is going to be a movement as a result of climate. But I think you'll note, the likes of Don from President of Kiribati, in the likes of Puala, from Prime Minister of Tuvalu, that they've really maintained that no, we're not going anywhere. We are staying where we are. And I just wondered whether that sort of narrative or message came through your conversation
Yes, and I think, you know, even as research applies, we're still trying to figure out what's the right word, because the word is mobility, but that's understood to also mean the immobilities and the choice to stay, and recognising the sensitivities of that. So it was probably my fault for actually not putting an explicit definition which included people moving and people staying, and the range of reasons for that.
I had exactly the same question.
Note for the next presentation, thank you.
I just wondered about the word mobility. Is this, I mean, mobility means simply that the people are proposing to move somewhere, be mobile, to or from places unspecified. Is this a subtle way of avoiding saying that they are abandoning their land or running away from their land? Surely not. They won't want to use terms like that. So it could mean that they're coming to higher ground temporarily and maybe going back again. But,
Yes.
you know, the sea is rising, it's not going down. So
Yeah.
mobility is possibly a one-way process.
Oh, yes, I don't know what we kind of know from some of the literature and even some of the anecdotal conversations that Dr. Hannah's had in PNG as we've kind of planned this out, is that I guess like the sea is rising, it's a movement, right? Yeah. The sea's always moving and people are always moving. So when we say mobility, it's not just from A to B full stop. You know, for people might go to A, B, they're going to go to D and then they'll come back to A, and you know, that's the nature, and I think that's what Hau'ofa was talking about as well. That's an enlarging of our world, that we just can't be confined to a unidirectional mobility. So that word mobility needs to be really heavy with meaning to capture all of that.
Ubers is proposing to buy, what do you want a piece of land there? You know, in your scope of study, you have taken into account the views of the people
Yes.
that are prepared to accept this climate immigrant.
Thank you for that question, and it's something that has come up in discussion with the other research teams as well. And probably Auckland and Waikato are doing much more broad scoping, community level, kind of country level, you know, methodologies and approaches. But that has been raised too, that we can't always just research the, you know, the potential movers, but the host communities, it's also really important there. So for example, in Niue, we have Tuvalu communities there. And so just getting all the different sides of that story would be really helpful.
Yeah. There's already a sense of not to stop there. There's a concern.
Yeah.
There's a concern for people when they move. Even though it's a government agreement, but at the community level, there's a sense of uncertainty.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we might leave it there, and I'd like to thank Tracy and the other presenters too. And yes, thank you all for coming along. Lovely to see a great big full room of people. And lunchtime now, obviously, and then after lunch, I think we're into debates and one more session, and then into debates and things. Thank you.